Hi, everyone. I decided to do a series on what are the earliest Christian Bible manuscripts. I think this is a series that we just need to have as a foundational understanding of where we stand in history, what has been recovered, what was corrupted, and then maybe I'm going to make several episodes. So this is just completely history, nothing theological per se, except we're going to talk about certain groups that get marginalized because they were being censored. And we're actually going to start there because if you don't know what was censored, you don't know how to look at this chart. We're going to show you charts of what has been recovered, what they date from, and so on. So you're going to see a big gap, and that gap isn't caused by things going into the dust. It was caused by censorship that happens much later, and you need to see where and when and why that happened, and then that lets you kind of understand where we stand today. So we're going to study in this episode, number one, we're going to study when did the censorship begin of the earliest Bibles, the earliest Christian Bibles, and that's crucial to understand that what we're looking at has come through a filter. Now, most of us are from Protestantism, maybe some of us are from Catholicism, but primarily Protestantism, and we look back and we think, oh well, the Catholic Church was lost, but we trust that all the manuscripts they were keeping were correct. That should be the first clue that we are making a mistake. That the Catholic Church was born, the Roman Catholic Church was born from Constantine, and we have a whole series on who he was, and he was not who he appears to be. So you're going to see the censorship coincides with when government power becomes united with Christianity and basically takes it over. So let's take a look at that. All right, so now let's turn to what we know are known facts of when extreme censorship occurred in the church, on the church, by people ostensibly speaking for the church. Okay, and what is the main group that gets marginalized that's of importance to Christians? You know, there are clearly wackadoodle heretical groups that we don't need to be concerned about. What we do need to be concerned about are the Ebion, because even Jerome admits this was the name of the earliest Christian church, the Ebion, and it meant the poor. And he mentions that because in Galatians, Paul says the pillars of the church, James, Peter, and John, told me to remember the poor at Jerusalem. And Jerome says that's another reference to the name of the apostolic church at Jerusalem. So now let's read. And so one of the explanations you have to have as a Christian is, why do none of these writings survive? In none of them, even when we look at a sense of James, did we get that free and clear of corruption? No, it came through the hands of Rufinus, who translated the Clementine homilies and Clementine recognitions. He then after he did his translation, he then destroyed all of the original Greek works or the works in Aramaic that it came from. And he makes no, apologies for it. And he is an admitter of corrupting texts so that it does not offend our Latin ears, is how he wrote in one of his works. And so we've covered that in recent episodes as well. So we do not have anything in the sense of James that we can 100% say for sure this is the way it originally read. I think it does mostly read that way, and I think I can suspect and reconstruct what is Rufinus's corruptions, but it's not 100% anymore. We can't be 100% sure. And the same thing for the letter of Peter to James. It's an Ebionite writing. Everybody agrees. But again, it's from the Clementine homilies literature, and therefore it went through the hands of Rufinus, an avowed corrupter, meaning guy who tells you, I go back and I rewrite things to not offend our Latin ears, meaning our doctrine of the 380s when he's doing his translations. So this is, and you're going to see why he's obeying Theodosius, and we're going to get to Theodosius's ruling here. So we need to reconstruct who these Ebionites are, but we're going to find out in this very opening 2 panels here some good news about the Ebionite writings. Anyway, so what happens? So I write here, this is in my book, Jesus Words Only, in 2005, and nothing's changed since then. We do not know the Ebionites' true views because we cannot find the Ebionite works preserved in any library anywhere. Imperial Rome, beginning with Theodosius' reign in 379 to 395, outlawed any religion but that of the, quote, bishops of Rome. So if you're a bishop in the East, you're an Assyrian Christian, Eastern Orthodox. You're not valid. Nobody but the bishops at Rome were now valid. And these people had become servants after Theodosius, for example, is a servant of the Roman Empire. And he's now commanding who becomes bishops. So the appointments, the structure, everything changes when Constantine corrupts the church in its structure, putting them on salaries, creating the idea of priests, calling them fathers. All this happens in this time period, even though it's clearly violative of Jesus, saying you cannot call anyone father. So this is just where it is. And so there is a Codex Theodosius, and that's this would be in chapter 16, part 1, section 2. This was enforced by the destruction of both public and private libraries in Roman territories. If any heretical material was found, the owner suffered the death penalty. So, for example, when this started with Constantine, the orders at the Council of Nicaea is anyone who held possession of the writings of Arius. And Arius contended Jesus was the Son of God, but not God the Son. And he was exiled, and all his writings were ordered banned and destroyed, and anyone who possessed them would be sentenced to death. Now, so is the Trinity or the deity of Christ adopted in an environment that made it an open and free will discussion? Was Jesus's words in John 17, verse 3 taken seriously, where he says the Father is the only true God? No, because why? Because Constantine is taking over the conference, and these are his decrees. If any heretical material is found, the owner suffered the death penalty. This suppression of historical works was interpreted broadly. For example, in 371 AD, Emperor Valens, that's the Emperor of Rome, ordered troops to remove from private homes at Antioch, Syria, works on liberal arts and the law, not just heretical works. So anything you owned, anything that was a writing was now being eliminated if it had any tendency of making you not what? Believe whatever the state is enforcing. Quote, discouraged and terrorized people all over the eastern provinces of the empire, wishing to avoid any possible suspicion, began to burn their own libraries. So why bother keeping anything in your house? Just get rid of it all. Burn it all. This is exactly what we're going through in the United States today. We have censorship. People refrain from saying certain things, whether it's in YouTube or on television or in other media outlets, and they are actually censored in the United States for just they're expressing an opinion that is considered dangerous. And in this era, danger was something that would undermine the state. And under Constantine, he had issued in 321 AD that all resting had to be on the day of the god of the sun, so Solis, Solis. That's what the law said. And he didn't like that the Christians weren't switching from Sabbath to the day of the sun, the day of the god of the sun. And there's no doubt he believed he was the god of the sun. Not only had he made that clear on all the coins he was issuing it up to that time, we now know at the day he dies in 337 AD, he has a coin commemorating that he is the god of the sun. And unlike any other emperor before him, he had it stamped on that commemorative coin at his death saying, Constantine is God. And then in the picture on the coin, it has him as Sol Invictus. He had conned us. He was a big fraud. But these people here, Theodosius and Emperor Valens, they now see the Christian religion as a tool that they need to control and suppress thought. And the enemy of that are the Ebion, because they are our original church, and they hold the values completely at odds. When did Jesus become indwelled by the Father? At his birth? No, they said it happened at his baptism. And how do we know they said that? Because it always said in Matthew and Luke, this day I've begotten thee, is what God says over Jesus' head at his baptism. So Jesus' birth spiritually was when? At his baptism in front of John. That violated what they believed, and that was in every Bible, Greek and Latin, until 405 AD when it was erased by Jerome in Matthew and Luke. And that's in 405 AD. But he missed, it's still there in Hebrews 1, verse 5, and Hebrews 5, verse 5. And Hebrews 5, in fact, has it saying that God the Father spoke to Jesus over him, this day begotten thee. So he missed it. That's his fault, but that's our benefit, that we can see the truth is still there. Let's continue. This grew worse under Theodosius. He's the first person to insist that we have to adopt the Trinity. Just so you know, many people think the Trinity was adopted at Nicaea. No, 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 no. It was never adopted at Nicaea. The deity of Christ was adopted in Nicaea. So you only had two gods in one Godhead as of 325. But Theodosius then had concluded that people were not going along with this, so he was going to add a third God, and that would be the God of the Holy Spirit. And then he had his favorite bishop, Gregory of Nyssa, write a book saying that the reason we need to adopt this third God in the Godhead is to put an end to the myth, and I'm quoting, the myth of monotheism. We have a whole video on that, and it's a book called The Great Catechism, and you can still read it. And Philip Schaff edited, so I'm not making this stuff up. That's what Philip Schaff said it says as well, to his surprise, I think. This grew worse under Theodosius. Then in 435 and 438 AD, the emperors of Rome again commanded the public burning of unorthodox books throughout the empire. So this is pervasively going on. So now, when I'm going to show you the manuscript history, this is now going to make sense of the manuscript history, why it is so barren until after these censorship periods. So effective were these decrees that there is not one single record written by an Ebionite that we can find preserved anywhere in any library. This is truly astonishing. We know them only through the interpretation of their enemies. Our only records of the Ebionites' views are what Roman government authorities allowed to escape from the fire because the Ebionites' writings were quoted in the approved writings of Eusebius and Epiphanius. And you can argue Rufinus gets close to preserving them, although he changes wherever it mentions Paul negatively, he changes it to Simon Magus, and wherever he can, he tries to interject a different view, as if the Trinity had already been adopted in the early AD 60s, 60 AD period. All right, let's continue. Thus, it is not fair to judge the Ebionites solely from their enemies' writings. What Eusebius says needs to be taken with a grain of salt, particularly when bias can so easily enter and distort the analysis. But here's the good news. A fortuitous discovery of Ebionite writings? Question mark. Or is this all we now have from the Ebionites? Did the world recently discover a treasure trove of their writings from which we can objectively measure their orthodoxy? A good argument has been recently made by Professor Eisenman and James, the brother of Jesus, that we have recovered some of the Ebionites' writings among the Dead Sea Scrolls. How so? So I'm writing that in 2005, and now it's 17 years later. Well, now we know for a fact it was the early Ebion. And now we also know why the Roman Catholic Church monopolized control and would not release the Dead Sea Scrolls for public examination by any commentators or theologians other than handpicked a few from all the way from 1945, 46, 47, whenever the scrolls were found until I think it's 1997 or so, 1990, in the 1990s. Eisenman forces it out of their hands by going directly to the people who were the custodian of the plates of the pages of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was a charitable organization. I think it was Carnegie Charity of some sort, and he, or Rockefeller, don't know which, and he convinced them to let the scholars see these things. We want to have more than just these select Catholic scholars doing this. And the Catholic scholars used this 40 years of basically manuscript control and censorship, if you think about it, to create a false narrative that the Essenes were in these Dead Sea Scrolls, who are never mentioned one time. And this is so effective, you will still hear scholars say, oh, it was the Essenes, because none of them went and thought, well, who are controlling these authors who keep telling us all these lies? But they don't know they're lies, so they keep thinking it's true. So the narrative was created that falsely made people think this had nothing to do with a sect that existed in the time of Christ. And now we know not only was the writings from the time of Christ in there, but from the Ebionites, but there were other groups that were in the time of Christ there. So these writings, it's now clear, actually came from the Temple of Jerusalem. They were secreted through the Herodian tunnel underneath the temple, when the Romans were sieging the temple. And Mr. Golb, Golb, did an excellent book that documents why that's obviously what happened. That's why these were preserved writings of the Christian era as well as the prior era. It was the entire library of the temple at Jerusalem, all their gospel, all their books, and they would keep books on opposing points of view. The Ebion view was kept there. The view of whoever they had, thought was important to keep their works, and they kept it in the library at the temple. So that's where they came from. So that's the good news. Now I'm going to show you a sort of a chart real quickly that will help give you an idea of how barren is everything prior to 371. So what did I show you here? 371, at least you can see that. You can see that Theodosius is enforcing the Trinity in 381, and he's going to issue death penalties for anyone who doesn't agree, or censorship, or exile, whatever it is. He's going to do whatever it takes, burning your books and so on, to enforce these new views. And since the Gospels were not completely consistent with this view, they had to be changed. And we've already showed you Matthew 19 that was radically altered. That Jesus said there was only one God, the Father above, and heaven, the creator of heaven and earth. Those words were removed. And we can show you that because why? What the censorship couldn't do is get rid of the early manuscripts of writers in the hundreds and the 200s that preserved the original quote from that passage. So we can reconstruct and get around this censorship. They didn't go after every single writing of people writing about the Bible or quoting the Bible, and that's how we have to recover this gap. I'm going to show you the gap now. All right, so basically a volunteer did a yeoman's job, if you will. It's bibletranslation.ws/manu.html. He has put a list in chronological order of all the manuscripts that we have of the New Testament, and you'll begin to see why what this really signifies when I go through it in more detail. But this is the list. He's going all the way up to the present of all the discoveries and their dates approximately. So I'm going to just show you, where is he right here? He's up to the 500s, the 600s, or the 6th century. Let's keep going here. And he's going to go, how far up will he go? He's going to go up to the 900s. Okay, so this is not everything that was Bibles in the past 900. And why would we care about that? That's when they first existed. They're so late, they don't really count for much. So what's always going to be the most authoritative? The things way, 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 way early. So let's just take a look at this so you can just see it, and so you can describe it to you. And I'm going to put this link in the link to this description. But what are we looking at here? So this is apparently the oldest, dates to about 100 AD, P52. And it's going to say Alexandrian. And what it means is there's an Alexandrian line, or the Alexandrinus Bible, that was recovered and given to the King James in about 1626. This has a sort of feel that we now call the Alexandrian, and it has a text version that's different than what we know is the majority text. So this majority text, or the Textus Receptus, was created before the discovery of the Alexandrinus, and which dates from about 450. And we'll get to that in a minute. It tells you what paper it's on, and it also tells you what's on it. And it's not a lot. It's John 18, verses 31 to 33, then verse 37 and 38. So there it is. There's your oldest piece of paper that we can find. Now, people are shocked. Like, you mean there's no Bible earlier than that? None. What is the era of the Ebionites? Prior to 100. What's happened to all their books? Completely erased and destroyed. Completely erased and destroyed. Why? Because they're deemed heretics. Why was it heretics? Well, we've gone through this a couple times. I'll go through it again. They believe Jesus he had his baptism and his birth. He had his new birth, his becoming Son of God at his baptism. This is where God says to Jesus, "This day I've begotten thee." This is in the Messianic Psalm 2. David is telling us what God's going to say to the Messiah in the future that will signify who he is, and that's what happens. The exact words that are in Psalm 2, God Yahweh speaks over Jesus at the baptism of Jesus, says, "This day I have begotten thee." And that's in Matthew and Luke, and it's quoted in all the earliest writings. Remember, I told you can always go to the quotations of people who are not being subject to censorship in their letters, and they're not considered important enough to care about. Well, they are the only way we can recover the way the text read before 100. We know what they said. For example, First Clement is an epistle. This is very important. Let me just show you something here. The Alexandrinus is going to be handed to us in a, what's it, 400? Okay, here it is. I actually have to find the Alexandrinus. Just want to show you. This is a really good book that it kind of, here's the Codex Sinaiticus, here's the Vaticanus. Sinaiticus is from the 4th century C4, and it's an Alexandrian, it's uncials, it has all the New Testament. I just want to pause there and show you that. The Codex Vaticanus is about the 4th century again, 400s, and then we keep going, and then we're going to get to we should get to that. Here it is, Codex Alexandrinus. Now this is technically 5th century because it's middle of 400. Okay, now in the back, very back of Codex Alexandrinus is the letter of First Clement. And why are you going to say that's important, Doug? Well, you'll see, because in this First Clement, you clearly know that it's written before the temple falls, because it actually talks about the sacrifices still going on at the temple. And Clement of Alexandria was the bishop of Rome. And this letter was quoted numerous times from the 1st century all the way into the 15th, 16th century. Somehow it disappeared. Well, I should say the 12th century, excuse me. So somehow it disappeared. What happened to it? Why did people not want to hear it? Well, it has some controversial thing in there, one of which is it quotes Jesus is at his baptism. God, Yahweh says to him, "This day I have begotten thee." So this work has to be destroyed, and is, as scholars have said, it's one of the most mysterious things that one of the most popular writings or documents of all time is completely been destroyed prior to the Alexandrinus being handed to King James in 1626, apparently, approximately. It's completely gone, and the scholars are mystified. How could this work not have one copy remaining? Because what? The Nicene Creed says that Jesus is the eternal Son of God, true God from true God, begotten, unmade. And so he's this eternal Son of God, God the Son. So this is incongruent that Jesus is told at his baptism, this day begotten thee. So you see, there's a reason to the madness of these people of why their fury is to ever accept anything was ever in the scripture that violated the Trinity doctrine, which is really something that never even existed until 325 as a bi-deity, and then in 381, Theodotion at the Council of Constantinople. So all these things are hundreds of years later, which cause a what? A censorship going backwards, not because Jesus' doctrines are wrong, because he doesn't speak like he's supposed to be. He's supposed to say, "I'm the Son. I'm God the Son," and he can't be begotten at his baptism. That would be wrong. So they've done everything they can to slander that position, and that was the Ebionites' view. Jesus was a man who was a righteous man, who God came to indwell at the baptism of Jesus. This day I have begotten thee. This is just too much for these people to stomach. So they're willing. What were they willing to do? How much were they willing to destroy of the Bible for how long just to keep this from your attention? Just to keep those few words from you hearing them. They're willing to destroy every Bible. Every Bible is destroyed. Every Bible is destroyed. Until when do we get to a real Bible? A Bible that actually has something in it. Whoa. Oh, here it is. This is the only Bible that's ever been found of the Gospels. The oldest one is a Sinaitic Syriac, and I've told you about this before. And this is from now when it says 3rd century or 4th century, that means the 200s to the 400s, and that's about right. It fits in that category. So this is the oldest Bible we have. It has all 4 of the Gospels. It has a few things missing at the end of Matthew, the last few verses there, and in the last few verses of Luke. And this is the one that has the Joseph begat Jesus. This is another reason there was so much suppression. What was their other doctrine at Ebionites? That Jesus was begotten of Joseph. And they insisted on it because Jesus could not be the Davidic heir unless that were true. But somebody corrupted, this is what the Ebionite position, had corrupted the text and put in this whole, cut off Joseph as the Davidic father of Jesus, and started putting in a story about a virgin birth, and then quoted Isaiah 7:14, and then had a the Ebionite claim it was a misrepresentation that it says a young virgin, because in Hebrew it says a young woman, not young virgin. But in Greek, parthenos, which is Greek, was a word only meaning virgin. And this is then obviously, when you read the context, the woman never had sex and she has the son. And that's the alleged miracle. And the Ebion hire Symmachus, a famous person, and this is the Ebion of the 200s. They hire him. He's one of the top scholars, a Hebrew scholar of translating the Hebrew Old Testament, or the Hebrew Torah, law and prophets, into Greek. And so they hire him to defend that this verse corruption is where this all comes from. That was their view, that by corrupting Isaiah 7, the young woman into young virgin in Greek, they said this is where this guy got this fictional idea. He made a mistake, and then he made up this whole story that it had to do with a virgin being born, and he thought that would help us. I'm who knows what they thought. I shouldn't say that. Maybe they thought it was to destroy them. I don't know. The point is, they said this is corruption. And Symmachus, for all his benefit in helping them, he gets labeled an Ebionite, and he's considered a heretic. Yet he's one of the most famous translators, a famous translator of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, because that was a replacement for the Septuagint, meaning he's taking the way the Bible really looked, and he was fixing all these ridiculous mistakes in the Septuagint Greek. So really, if we ever wanted to know what was the true Hebrew Bible at that time, we need to restore the Symmachus Bible and try to find it in history. But apparently, because he's an Ebionite, it gets destroyed, even though he was famous. How do I know he's famous? Because when you go to the Hexapla of Oregon, and the Hexapla is 6 different translations, as I recollect, of the Hebrew Bible. And Oregon is a Christian in the 200s, and he's trying to assemble all the different translations of the Hebrew Bible. And he puts Symmachus is I think it's the 3rd translation over. And then he has Theodotion, I think is another one, who's also from the same era as Symmachus. So he's putting their translations side by side by side. Why would he do that unless he's the top dog? Unless this guy's a top translator. So we know why this book is itself suppressed. And there's only one in it. Only one. Now the Curiton Syriac also has Joseph begat Jesus. So I should mention that. And that comes a little later. But these two come out of the dirt, out of the dust in middle 1800s. They're nowhere in sight earlier than that, and they're found in a monastery and in the Sinaitic Syriac that was found with the Christian Bible, overwritten by a book that was from the 600s, and they basically had run out of paper, so they said, "Hey, just pick up an old Bible and we'll just write over it." So these scholars, had to meticulously go in and read between the lines what was the original Bible, and that's how they recovered it and did all kinds of plates. And this was Cambridge University, top dog. So this is an absolute, verified Bible. And we keep that available for everybody who uses our public domain list of books. So we have, I'll put a URL for the public domain book so you can get a copy of the Sinaitic Syriac. Then there's the Curiton Syriac. So, ladies and gentlemen, look. These are just scraps of paper. Until then, why? Why are they scraps of paper? Because they say things they don't want you to learn about. What don't they want you to learn about? Joseph begat Jesus. Why? He would be a human being. We can't have Jesus be a human being. We got to get rid of that. The Ebionites upset about that. So what? We don't care. Hey, what about Joseph? God, Yahweh says over his head, "This day begotten thee." We can't have that. He was born in eternity. He's a demigod. He was eternally God the Son. So we can't have him, receiving his baptism and his becoming Son of God at his baptism. We got to get rid of that. See, my friends, there is a reason, but for the madness. This is a madness against the Ebionites, nobody else. That's why they're destroyed in history. But do you see now why God preserved them in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and why the Catholic Church was so adamant and not let anyone ever see them? If it weren't for the basic, Eisenman, he's a justified thief. Had he not gone to the people who had the plates and said, "You've got to release this in the interest of academic truth. You've got to release these plates of the Dead Sea Scrolls so people can see them," and he never knew what were even in them. They're all filtered through these other alleged scholars. These basically people were mouthpieces for the Catholic Church. And now we can see what they were hiding for 40 years. It was the Ebion, the early church writings. And what did we find out? What is there any truth about Paul we learned in that? Oh, yes, my friends. Oh, yes. We learned he's called the enemy, and his opponent is the Zadik, which is the known moniker for James the Just. The word just means Zadik in Hebrew. So the just one is up against a person called the spouter of lies and the enemy. And they debate with him, and they use the Habakkuk Pesher and another book called the Doctrine of Good Works to prove that this person has a false doctrine of misreading Habakkuk 2 verse 4 as being you're saved by faith, not works. I couldn't make this stuff up if it weren't true. And that's what Mr. Eisenman has been trying to expose, and it began in 2005 with that book that I've told you about, the brother James, the brother of Christ of Jesus, and now he's done 4 or 5 more works. But seemingly, the Protestant world should be paying a lot of attention. The Christian world, of course, should also be, because it's our original church. But silence. It's complete silence. If they don't talk about it, if they don't draw your attention to it, I mean, the worst thing they could try to do is try to refute it, because they would draw attention to it. So they'd rather just be silent. Silent. We won't talk about it. We'll never tell anyone that the Ebion's writings were found. I mean, that's what they think. By whispering real low just to themselves, they'll let themselves know the truth. The Ebion writings have been found, but that's it. So that's the bottom line. So now we really should add in here the Ebion writings. And even though they're just doctrinal confrontations with a guy named the enemy, the guy named the spouter of lies, so what? Put them in here. That's what I would do. And I would put them, you know where they go? You know where they go, ladies and gentlemen? They go before 100 AD. They go before, because they're found in the Dead Sea. They're the original writings kept at the Temple of Jerusalem before 70 AD, because that's exactly how come they are in the Dead Sea. They're secreted out before the 70 AD siege. While that's going on, they had this tunnel, the Herodian tunnel, that would take you all the way down to the Dead Sea. They put it in a cave, but you know what? 1 million people died in that siege, and the people who hid it died, unfortunately. And as a result, it's really a blessing for us, because they never did recover the writings that they put there. They put them there for safekeeping. And you know what? They never got to use them again. They thought they could. I'm sure they were planning on using them again, and they all died, because the Romans were very thorough in eviscerating and destroying every single one of their lives. Okay, so I think I've made the point. There is this huge gap, and you can just see these are just little bits and pieces. Revelation 1. Let's just show you a little bit of what I'm talking about. Oxy L 3523 from 150. John 1836 to 19:7. Is that much of the Bible? No. Okay, Revelation. What's this one? P9S. This is Revelation 1:13 to 2:1. Is that a lot of the Bible? No. Now, this one is P64 to 67. This has Matthew 3:9, the verse, and verse 3:15, chapter 5, verses 20 to 22, chapter 5 verses 25 to 28, chapter 26 to 7 to 8, and 10, 14 to 15, verses 14 to 15, 22 to 23, 31 to 33. So you see what I'm saying? There's nothing here. There's nothing here. We could go through the whole thing. Now this is a little more. P46. Now this, by the way, is only one copy. One copy. Now this is a lot of Paul's epistles, so let's be frank. But you can see there's very scattered things. But this is it. I mean, in all of history, until this was found, we had nothing to prove where Paul's writings came from. Okay, because nothing of Paul's writings even exists. Okay, until a writing of 200. So even Paul's writings are being expunged. Well, you have to know the early church didn't like Paul's writings, and the Marcionites loved Paul's writings. So there was a battle and a tug of war to get rid of Paul's writings from the Orthodox, the Ebion. So the Ebion didn't like Paul's writings. So just be frank here. That was their other position, that the later church loves Paul because he gets rid of Sabbath, he gets rid of all the law. The Roman Catholic Church is anti-law. If you don't know it, you haven't read Catholicism very well. Then they don't believe in the law. They in fact persecuted anyone who would keep Sabbath as a Judaizer, and they actually had laws in the Catholic Church against Judaizing. Okay, and that's where that word really came into the popular usage among Christians, Catholic, and Protestant. To call someone a Judaizer meant you were a criminal for teaching God's law in Roman Catholicism, and it meant a heresy in Protestantism that you were a Judaizer. Anyway, so this is it. But that's all this is. P46 is just Paul's writings, and that just documents another fact that what's important is Paul's writings, if they were ever kept, they were kept totally apart from the Gospels. So when we recover later the Gospels, we recover them completely whole, except one work, Sinaiticus, is the Sinaiticus of Tischendorf in Greek. That one has Paul's epistles in it. So let me just show you something here. So when we find the Syriac Sinaiticus, let's go back to that again. I just want to go back to the Syriac Sinaiticus. There is that. Okay, the Sinaitic Syriac, or I call it the Syriac Sinaiticus. This one is only the Gospels, nothing else, right? The Curaton Sinaiticus, same thing, only the Gospels. If you look at the Codex Bezae, which let's see if we can find that. Codex. Okay, I had to turn this into text in order to find it. It's right over here. It's it's dated to 400 AD, and it's in Greek and Latin digalote. So it has both Greek on one side, and on the right side it has Latin translation, and that's helpful, by the way. And what does it have? It has Gospel, Acts, and 3 John. And not even sure about that 3 John there, but when you go over to, I want to show you the publication by Scrivener in the 1800s. Scrivener says it's just the Codex Bezae ends with the book of Acts, and he then assumes if it is, because that's all we have, he then figures out what would have been the length of the book. But that's how it is. It's the book of Acts is how his presentation of it of the Bezae Codex Catabrigiensis, being an exact copy in ordinary type of the celebrated Uncial Greco-Latin manuscript of the 4 Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, written early in the 6th century. Now, scholars have now put it into the 4th century, the 400s approximately. But this is what he thought at the time. Scrivener, Cambridge, 1864. Now, I'm going to surprise you with a little treat here. What did I tell you? If you went back in time, are you going to find the original Greek and Latin texts said Jesus was begotten as the Son of God at his baptism? Well, that's exactly what you have here. So let me just show you. This is this is how it looks, and this is right out of page 173 of Scrivener's Codex Bezae. And by the way, the King James Bible fully had knowledge that this was something that Beza himself, that's who it's named after, he was the leader of the Calvinist party after Calvin died. He had taken this out of a monastery, not properly, not with legal authority, but he took it anyway to preserve it. That's his justification. And I'm glad he did in a sense, but he shouldn't have stolen it, but he did. Anyway, whatever. This is what we find. It's page 173. You can even see the words there. Facta filius meus est tu ego odie genui te erat autem ius. So what does that say in Latin? And I'm going to show you the whole context. So these are all the words. I did a little translation, but here's an excerpt. John, after all had been baptized, then heaven opened, and a holy corporeal figure of a dove came down on him, on Jesus, and a voice from heaven spoke, "You are my son. Today I have given birth to you at the age of 30 years." Why is that missing from our Bibles? Why is that gone? Oh, it violates the Nicene Creed, which says Jesus was an eternal Son. He was begotten, not made, from all eternity. He didn't exist. He didn't come to birth at this time. And see, this passage, by the way, then refutes the whole idea of the virgin birth. And so you can't have these things. You gotta get rid of this stuff. All right. All right. So what's the point of all this so far that I've demonstrated to you is that the reason in order to know why there's such an expungement, a censorship of all of this early era of the church until we get, and these are just scraps, John 17, 1 to 2, 17, 20. I mean, these are scraps, nothing burgers until we get to the Sinaitic Syriac. And even that was just a blessing out of the sky from God. And that's so just the 4 Gospels and that's it and nothing else. And has a lot of stuff that people don't want to hear about either. So there you go, Curetonian. But this is from the 200s to the 300s. Okay, Curetonian Syriac, a little later than the Sinaitic Syriac, they believe. So that's why, because there's doctrines that have to be driven out of Christianity that defied the Nicene Creed. Anything that would say that Jesus was not begotten as a virgin, from a virgin, which would make him a deity, Potentially. Instead, it said originally that this day begotten thee at the baptism of Jesus Christ. It's still there in Hebrews 5:5. That's the key, ladies and gentlemen. You want to see how it read originally in Luke and in Matthew? Just read Hebrews 5:5. Jerome overlooked it. And I'll tell you where this all comes from. There was a dispute, real quick. A dispute between Bishop Festus and Augustine in 382. It's a documented dialogue between them, epistles. And Bishop Festus is quoting Matthew and Luke with the original "This day begotten thee" both times in full context and full quotes. And he's telling Augustine, you cannot be both a Matthean and a Nicene Christian. You have to pick. And Augustine responds. He never disputes how Matthew read. He never disputes that the Luke versions that Festus is relying upon are actually existent. He simply says, I've heard that some of one of the codices of Luke do not have "this day have begotten thee." He doesn't say he's seen it. He doesn't say who gave him this statement, and so on. And scholars who want to see this verse disappear say that Augustine affirmatively said he knew it didn't exist. That's not what he says. He says, I've heard, or I think he says, some say. So we have that Latin text, and we have a whole video on that whole dispute between Festus and Augustine. So that happens in 382. And Augustine is a frequent traveler to Rome. He knows the bishop. He knows the bishop of Rome, which means the Pope. He also knows the secretary to the Pope, a guy named Jerome. And he can ally with Jerome and say, hey, would you do us a favor? We are being told that the Nicene Creed is contradictory of these passages in Matthew and Luke. Could you just get rid of them, please? They're obviously heresy. Just get rid of them. And what does Jerome do? Like he did in so many instances, he put in fraudulent Trinity passages. We know they're fraudulent because they're not there in the early church. And then he's going to take out these two passages. What a crime. Well, look at whose words he removed. Not just Jesus' words. He removed the words of Yahweh from heaven. What do you think God's going to do to Jerome? He's going to boil him in oil and he won't survive. Or at least that's what if that's his fault. Okay, I'm just going to say I don't have proof positive he's the one, but he was the last editor of the Latin Vulgate. He was friends with Augustine. Augustine got beaten by Bishop Festus over this issue. So I'm going to be honest, I'm inferring that Jerome did this to cooperate with his buddy, Augustine. Whether he did or didn't is for God to know, and I don't know. But the bottom line is, it's not there anymore, and it belonged, and that's the whole thing. There's a pattern to what's removed. Everything the Ebionites stood for, that Jesus was a righteous man who grew up and at 30 years of age was baptized with the Holy Spirit, that God came down on him in a dove and came to dwell in him, as Jesus says. And just as John 17:1-3 says, Jesus says the only true God is the Father. And so they believe that. Matthew 19 used to read that the only true God, when Jesus has a guy come rushing up to him and saying, hey, a good teacher, can you tell me how to have eternal life? And before Jesus answers the question, he says, why do you call me good? There's none good but the Father alone, the creator of heavens and earth. That's what it used to say. I put this together from 4 early quotes of the early church that you can find inside of earlychristianwritings.com, but I found one they didn't have. And so we put it all together and proved that Jesus said the same thing in Matthew 19 that you read in John 17:1-3. So it's not a mistake that Jesus says there's only one God, and he's the Father, not me. He makes that clear. So all the verses you think are Trinitarian in the New Testament are not even there originally. They were all added later by Jerome, and we can prove that. All the ones you think that are there, even the baptismal thing, baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that wasn't original either. That's added later. So anyway, all I'm going to say is this is why there is nothing before 100, except he should have put in there the letter of Clement. And why do I say that again? That was recovered in the Alexandrinus Bible in the very back. It was the first epistle of Clement. And what does it say? Jesus at his baptism, God said, this day I've begotten thee. This is something that had to be destroyed, even though it was one of the most popular letters, was part of the original Christian canon. Most people agree that was always part of the canon. If you wanted to read something, you would include it among the epistles that would be read. And it was cited more often than most anything in the early church. And yet it was disappeared. And scholars in the 1500s are scratching their heads. Where did that thing go? Well, it violated the rule against purging everything that the Jewish Christian church, the apostolic church, ever taught. The apostles of Jesus Christ, their teachings, their residual message had to be destroyed and purged and censored out of history, when instead it's the actual fact of life. And thank God it showed up in the Dead Sea Scrolls that makes it completely unequivocal. God bless everybody. Take care. Ciao. Bye.